Well, good morning. The purpose of this session is to think and define, in a way, justice. So I will do this with Alex in some sort of a self-moderated way. But just before we start, I'm thinking definition is a boring thing. It's defining things is what usually lawyers do a lot. But I think it's very important to have an idea about what we talk when we talk about justice. And our previous speakers had a very good introduction. But to me, it's bringing a memory, because my son, he's now a law student, but a long time ago, I was traveling with my young son and daughter. They were like 3 and 5, and we were at an airport. And I was alone with them. And then a smiling border police officer is asking my daughter, "Is this your dad? Is this your father?" And she says, "No." And then she looks and asks my son, who is a little bit older, and she says, "Is this your father?" And he said, "No." And then all of a sudden, just like in a Western, like I saw my life flipping, and I'm in jail forever. And then all of a sudden, other police officers are appearing, and then everything is very nervous. And another police officer is saying, "Are you guys sure this is not your father?" And I said, "No, no." And it takes some time, and then again, my daughter is being asked, and she's already irritated, and she's being asked, "Are you sure this is not your father?" And she says, "No, this is our daddy. This is not our father." So definitions matter. So how we define justice is very important. And another recent experience, I just like probably all of us here, I'm very much concerned about climate justice. And there was a book about climate change and justice. And I thought, yeah, that's interesting, and flipped through the book, and it turned out that the author's main argument is that climate change and justice are related. But the way that she described justice was incredibly broad. She was talking about corruption. She was talking about failure of governance, and so on and so forth. And I thought, wow, that's quite an interesting idea about justice. And it's brought me to thinking that justice can be seen as a moral value. It can be seen as an ethical ground on which we say whether something is good or bad. Justice is also the justice institutions, the justice professionals. But I think many of us in this room think of justice more in terms of relationships. Like, we are in dozens, probably hundreds of relationships. So a family relationship is one big space, but we are also in employment relationships, relationship with our states, or there are people who don't have states, so the lack of relationship there is causing even more problems. So in all these relationships, we constantly get into situations in which we need to know the law, to somehow make sure that these relationships get repaired, get some sort of maintenance. And for me, at least, this is the justice where I see the need to focus, and also the level of justice where things can be changed. Of course, corruption, governance, rule of law, democracy are very important, but we shouldn't forget this huge space of relationships that get broken in one way or another, and people need justice. So for me, justice is this relationship space. And I'm very curious, Alex, you worked all around the world. What is for you justice? How would you describe it?
Thank you, Martin. I like how you put it. Yeah, I like this idea of relationships, and I will add something, which is, in general, relationships in the modern world are somehow structured under laws, right? And In every country there are laws, just that somehow put some structure and context on those relationships and put some rights and responsibilities on different people, different institutions, and so on. And I will put justice, I will look at this from a very practical perspective. So everybody has rights, everybody has responsibilities. So the rights there, so justice is when people can actually enjoy the rights that the law provides, can enjoy the opportunities that the law provides. And when someone violates those rights, there are ways in which people can obtain redress and can indeed obtain redress. So it's a very straightforward way of thinking about these relationships within the context of the law, and in which when we start thinking about all the different justice issues that we may encounter, we can put those into that framework. So whether those are, as you were saying, employment conflicts or family-related problems or problems for obtaining benefits from the government or experiencing a crime. So all of that really just falls into these categories. And I think something important is to think about this from a very practical, concrete, even personal perspective. Thinking about growing up in my native Mexico, just my family and I, in many cases, experience different ways of injustice, either experiencing a crime and the consequences that that may have, or even just not being able, for example, to have access to the inheritance of my grandmother, or even the retirement savings of my father, because my mother didn't really know how to navigate the justice system, and it was complicated. So all of that really is personal. And this affects really people in all different countries. This is not something from low-income countries. This affects people in developed countries, in developing countries, affects different people at different stages or at different spaces in the income distribution. This is something that we have looked. Obviously, it has a higher impact on people just living, for example, in low-income countries, where we see that the types of problems that people experience are often more impactful, more serious. It has more impact, for example, as well on people of low income. Usually people of low income experience more problems because, as we were saying before, they are not really enjoying the benefits of the law, and then as a result, more people violate their rights. And when they are actually trying to look for redress, they often don't find it. And that's something that we see often in the data, just when we see that. So I think, as you were saying, I think, I mean, this is based on relationships, but at the same time, it's concrete. It is practical. It affects just our daily lives. Yes, it also relates to constitutional law, international conflict, and so on, but at the same time, it's very, very concrete and affects people's lives. And importantly, in many countries, and I think this is the topic of today's conversation, justice is not delivering. No, and that's something that we need to pay attention to. And indeed, you have also worked in a lot of countries, and perhaps can talk a bit about this idea of the justice gap, and more importantly, some of the historical, institutional reasons why the justice gap exists.
Before I get there, just to make the point that the justice gap is not associated with low and middle-income countries. World Justice Project just finished the big round of surveys in European Union countries, and the gap is there. If you look at the States, Canada, the Netherlands, it's not like it's eliminated by income, or rising income. Actually, probably the other way around. With more income, we see more problems, but we will come to that. Why? You asked me about the justice gap. Why now? Why didn't why people didn't talk in 1955 or in 1568? So why now? And I think there are many things. I think first it's the environment. The 20th century, with all its terrible things, was a century of humanism and looking at people. So it is the century of human rights, social responsibility, putting people at the center in many different fields, not in justice, unfortunately, but in many other social and important areas, the individual became more and more important. Justice is catching up, and probably if there are healthcare or educational professionals here, they will be a bit puzzled about why we are talking about paying attention to the people and putting the people at the center. But it's not only the environmental factors. I think there are also institutional factors and personal factors. Now we see a cohorts of leaders like the Honorable Vice President who have their personal experience to tell others and to influence others. We have these incredible leaders who can tell about justice and people-centered justice from their own perspectives. We have emerging international frameworks. We're going to talk about OECD, we're going to talk about the Task Force for Justice, the strategy of USAID, which is very inspirational, about other frameworks. And also we have an infrastructure of people like the people here. And there are many other people in different parts of the world who are saying, wait a second, how come that everything else is changing when I'm going to a hospital or police station or a train station or an airport, and I see this whole different experience, especially people like me who can remember like 40 years ago and say, wow, the world changed. And then you go into a courtroom or a lawyer's office and indeed you don't see the typewriter, but nothing much has changed. So I think these are some of the factors that kind of made us talk about people-centered justice. But I'm curious, what's your explanation? Why do we see the justice gap now? And also, if you can give it a little bit of parameters, like, is this a big thing, a small thing, deep or shallow?
I think you're right, Martin, and you provided some very good points about why the justice gap exists. I think many are related to history, institutions just over past. In general, justice institutions were not built for the people to begin. So, and I think that's something that it's important to remember when really thinking about how justice institutions operate. And as a result, as we have been talking, there is still a big justice problem. Just based on an exercise that we did a few years ago, we were able to quantify, let's say, the justice gap around the world. Thinking about the definition that I just made before, or the concept, what we calculated was that if we think about the people who do not have access to the opportunities that the law provides, so those are people who, for example, do not have legal documentation or who are working in the informal economy, we have about 4.5 billion people around the world that somehow struggle to really take full advantage of those opportunities. If we think about the people who have had a problem, let's say in the past 2 years, a legal problem, and somehow were not able to resolve it because they didn't access the justice system, they didn't know where to go, they didn't have access to information, or it took forever to resolve the problem. There are about 1.5 billion people just that face these issues, either in the criminal, civil, or administrative space. And obviously this is huge. These are figures that we calculated a few years ago. But when we look at the figures, you mentioned the report that we produced recently, in which we interviewed about 65,000 people in the European Union, and compare some of the findings from the results that we had a few years ago. And the results have changed, but very little. Just in some countries positive, in some countries negative. And we know there are obviously factors that influence this. The pandemic played an important role, both negative and positive. So there were backlogs, but at the same time, some countries started digitalization and so on. But when we look at some of the global trends, and this is based on another exercise that we have done as part of the Rule of Law Index, where we interview about 2,500 lawyers around the world every year and ask them about the functioning of the justice systems, the performance of the civil justice system has been declining in the majority of countries around the world for the last 5 years. So it's not that we are just on the way of closing the justice gap. There are improvements, there are innovative leaders, but overall, just this is a trend that we're seeing. And this is obviously something that this conference, and the community is really just trying to look at this. But obviously, Martin, you have also done some work around the world, and it's not only about the numbers, but it's really about just that people in many cases cannot find solutions, and in many cases have important consequences in their lives.
Yes, with my colleagues from HiiL, we put a lot of efforts to measure this gap and understand also the consequences, as you say, because in court statistics, we see in a particular country there are X amount of family cases, Y amount of contractual cases, but when you go deeper, you see what it means. And we have countless stories, but I just want to mention one or two that kind of left a huge impact on me. So one story was from rural Bangladesh, where we spoke to a young lady who told us how when she was very young, like 12 or 13, her mother and father wanted to marry her off, arranged marriage, meaning that her education stops. But this girl, I'll call her Murshida, was incredibly courageous and audacious. So she ran away. She went to live with other members of her household and continued her education. And because of a big organization, legal aid organization called BRAC, she managed to file a case, make sure that she does not get married. The paralegals from BRAC made sure that she filed a case, she gets her child maintenance from her father. So this is a story that also shows how if Murshida didn't find her way, which was pretty unsecured way of protecting her rights, she probably would have been in a very different place. Another story that kind of stuck in my mind is we spoke to a person in Jordan who was telling us how his son, who has serious mental issues, 23 years old, but with serious mental disability, is being cheated and taken advantage by a financing company who made him sign a lot of promissory notes, a lot of obligations, and then this company is going after the family and then almost ruining the business. And then this person was telling me how without being helped, probably his business and his family will be in a very different place. So these are relatively good examples, but you can imagine, and you know from surveys, how many do not manage to find this help and how they don't manage to deal with all this complexity of what Professor Gillian Hatfield calls low-tech world. So there are a lot of repercussions individually, and we heard in the first panel how it can impact people. But I'm sure, Alex, from your work, you've seen also how these consequences of unresolved problems, and there are billions of problems, and billions of them remain unresolved. What do they mean for the social outcomes? If you look from kind of a more social level, what does lack of justice mean?
That's a very good point, Martin. That's a very good point. There we go. It's a good point. because you pointed out some of the impact that the justice problems actually have on individuals, and that there are a lot of stories behind some of the surveys. But something that is important to remember as well is that justice is not isolated. All the justice problems are related to other outcomes, just at the individual or societal level. And I can think of at least 4 that are quite relevant for the conversation that we're having today. So the first one is justice and safety. So we know just from the literature on crime, for example, how important it is in many cases how conflict can turn into violence, or just unsettled disputes can turn into violence and then effectively just result in crime. We know just that one of the main drivers of crimes obviously is just not only the lack of performance of the criminal justice system, but also sometimes the lack of opportunity and conditions just that people may face. And in many cases, these may derive indeed from this issue that we were talking about, the lack of legal identity or the lack of legal opportunities. I mean, opportunities to indeed take advantage of the law or use the law for advancing opportunities. So that is an important one. And just there are others. So the second point, somehow related to this, which is justice and stability. So we know from the conflict literature just that in many cases conflict may arise because of resource issues, land, water. So all of that obviously has an impact and might derive in conflict, just in the conflict of countries. Violence or crime just can turn into displaced populations and effectively just affect the stability of a country. So that is obviously an important one. A third one, very important, migration. So we know that justice problems can indeed be one of the push factors for migration. Let me tell you, just a few years ago, 3 years ago, we did a study in Central America. We interviewed about 10,000 people in different countries in Central America, and we asked questions about migration. Interestingly, we think, for example, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, about between 30 and 50% of people were thinking about migration, and indeed about 15% were already making plans to migrate. And obviously the main factor is economic opportunities. But the second most important factor that they describe was related to violence, corruption, harassment, lack of justice. So to give you a sense of this, in El Salvador, approximately 40% of people were mentioning that as the main reason for migration. In Honduras, 55% of people. In Guatemala, a little bit lower, 25% of people. So this indeed affects decision of migration. And not only that, whenever they arrive to the country, they often are at a disadvantage. You have studied migrant populations and know how difficult it is for them to incorporate into the country. In many cases, because they don't have access to the law, they cannot use the justice systems to defend their rights. So it's a challenge just when they leave their countries, but also when they arrive to the new country. It also affects economic outcomes, and this is something that it's important when we think about small, middle-income enterprises, micro-enterprises, even large enterprises. So obviously when they are thinking about the return on investment, they have to consider contract enforcement, whether if I do a deal with the government, is the government going to pay me back? If I deal with a provider, is they going to pay me back? And if not, how difficult is it going to resolve the issue when I go to court? Is it going to take forever to resolve the issue, or I won't be able to enforce it? So all those issues obviously affect the return to investment and effectively affect investment. So it's closely related, all these, the performance of the justice system, justice outcomes are closely related to economic outcomes. So I think all of that is really, we shouldn't be thinking about justice as an isolated issue, but on the contrary, it's a closely related issue to other outcomes. Obviously, Martin, I see that we're just getting close to the end of our conversation. How do we move from here? What do we do?
I think it's very important to not stop here in terms of identifying the problem. Because frankly, I see a threat that not we here, but general community, the abstract world says, okay, now we know there is a problem, thank you, it is fine, we estimated it, it's clear, the epidemiology has been done, so now we are in a good state. So I think we need to continue, but also go deeper to understand more of the nuances, to understand much more who is encountering problems, who is solving problems, what is solving problems. Do we need more courts, more law schools, more lawyers, or we need more community justice centers, more easy and people-centered procedures? Is mediation better than adjudication, or is mediation better in this particular case than adjudication in this particular case? So there are so many nuances that depend on we not stopping here and not saying, yes, we have a problem, and it's clear that it is there. And my last probably dream is linked to what you said, is that we have to figure out the linkages between justice and many other fields and problems. We had a project in Honduras where we were talking to internally displaced people, and people never would say, I have a problem with justice. It's always some sort of a bunch of violence, because of violence, or because of losing income of violence. So very complex relationship that is never cleanly cut about justice. So understanding these relationships and figuring out what and how to improve injustice, I think is very important for me. So what about you? Where should we go next?
I agree. I think you're right. The first one is to recognize the problem. I think it's important to measure it, it's important to acknowledge it, so that's the first step. So we need to recognize the problem. But I think that the second one, and this relates to the conversation that we were having in the morning, it's think differently. And I think just solving this problem is very challenging. And to a certain extent, we need to put people at the center and think differently on how to solve these problems, not simply doing all the stuff, focusing on institutions, on processes, on procedures, on laws, but really trying to put people at the center. And just people-centered justice is really just what this is about. We know just we need to identify the needs of the people, just to begin identifying the barriers that they face, just where they effectively encounter problems, not when we think that they encounter problems, and try to think in solutions to address those problems just where people are actually. So there are, I think, a lot of tools available. I mean, for this, the OECD has produced a recommendation that guides countries on how to think about people-centered justice. Importantly, not necessarily transforming entire systems, but really just adopting a new approach for just doing it either in a transformational way or in spaces in which there are opportunities for change. So thinking about outcomes, thinking about the justice journey, thinking about prevention, thinking about using data. So I think this is really about thinking differently. And I think the last point relates to something that I mentioned. I think that justice is not isolated. We need to recognize that justice is connected to other issues. And if we want to address these other issues, it's important to recognize the role that justice plays. So if we want to address the issue of migration, so we need to recognize the drivers of migration and why some of the problems just maybe pushing people out of their country. So we really need to think systemically and really think about the interconnections that different outcomes may have to just drive better solutions. And this is, I mean, just going back to the point at the beginning, this is not only an issue of just low-income countries. This is an issue just of all countries. I mean, and all countries somehow need to put this into their agendas.
Thank you very much, Alex. And this was all from us. In the spirit of cuts and savings, you saw we managed without a facilitator. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin.